Okay. Okay, so if you have to speak about figures, who are the personalities throughout history that are specifically related to the holiday of Shavuot? So the first one that will come to mind, of course, is Moses, because that's the time we got the Torah, and Moses is the one who brought us the Torah, so certainly Moses is connected to Shavuot. Later in history, you also have King David, because the tradition is that King David's birth was on Shavuot. I'm sorry. King David's passing was on Shavuot. That's what the Talmud says. And finally, we have, again, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, whose passing was also on Shavuot. So these are the three figures that we want to talk about. In other words, what they represent. So you have, in the idea of the development of the implementation of the Torah, so you have Moses, and then you have approximately 400 years later, a little bit more, you have King David, and then 2,000 years later, a little bit more, 2,500 years later, is you have the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And again, we're talking about these as individuals, but really it's the model of life in three different eras, and more specifically within the person, like I said, each person has some of those three perspectives, a little bit of different areas in life which correspond to these three perspectives. So I think what best way to do it was to sort of give the brief thesis, and then we'll read some of it inside. So the idea is as follows. Where is the Torah? The Torah, how do I say this? There's really three ways where the Torah can play out. The Torah plays out in times of Moshe, where we are taking the stories, following the stories, we are in a state that is above nature. It's a miraculous state. We're going out of Egypt, there are miracles, and there are miracles in the desert. So it's an era of miracles. So in some sense, what that represents is that the power of a Jew connected to God could go above nature. Things can happen, unusual things can happen. That's one period through which we study Torah, or we received the Torah, when we were in a supernatural era. That would be Moses. Then you look at King David, and King David is certainly not supernatural. It's very natural. He was a successful monarch. He was a successful warrior. He's building a country, a kingdom. People in the land of Israel, of course, are engaged in agriculture, in commerce, in functioning economy, unlike the days of Moses, who taught the Jewish people when they were in the desert, sort of removed from the world. And yet, everything was, you could sense that they're being successful. If you had to pick a time in Jewish history when you would want to live in Israel, the best time to live in Israel, throughout all of Jewish history, it would have to be probably the days of King Solomon, which is right after King David, King David's son, because the temple was already built and all the people had peace. There was peace in the land. Now, of course, why was there peace in the land in the days of Solomon? Not because that's what God told David. That God told David he can't build a temple because he's a man of war. I says, your son Solomon, his name is Shlomo, peace, because there'll be peace in his days. He's going to build the temple because he's a man of peace. Now, I always like to say, why is the son a man of peace? Because his father killed all the bad guys. So what I'm trying to say here is that period, Solomon, but even before that, King David, is a tremendous amount of success, and things are going, you could tell that they're being blessed. It's a blessed time. So if Moses is above nature, David is a time when they're within nature, but nature is blessed. You could sense that it's a divine blessing flowing through natural means. Okay? And that's another area where the Torah and the Jewish life develops. And then you have another time, that's the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is deep in the exile in Eastern Europe, where people were suffering, and there was terrible times. And yet the Baal Shem Tov could teach you and teaches the people, to encourages them and understand and sense that God is with us even when we don't see the blessing, and when we look around us, we see pain and difficulty and sorrow. And yet the Torah can the Torah can inspire the Jew to lift himself above and not be bound by the external difficult circumstances. So in that sense, these three characters who are all connected to Shavuot, it's really how the Torah plays out in three specific eras or general eras. You can have the Torah, and the Torah could uplift you to a time like Moses, where you see miracles in your life. Okay. You could have the Torah and understand that even when you're within nature, you're working within the structure of nature. Nevertheless, Hashem is with you and Hashem blesses you. Okay. Step number 2. And then in some sense, the lowest, but in other senses, maybe the deepest point here is that even when you're in a situation like the Jews were in exile in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, where it was essentially a difficult life, and you have not seen miracles, and you have not seen success, and you don't see anything necessarily easy or good in your circumstances that you could point to and say, oh, I see the hand of Hashem. Nevertheless, the Hasidic teachings teach you how to sense the presence of God and get inspiration from the Torah. And in some sense, the way that Rebbe is going to talk about it is be uplifted over your circumstances. Even in that situation. In some sense, that's the deepest thing. That's the greatest challenge and the deepest idea. So in the essay, it's going to be spoken about in terms of monarchy. Monarchy, if you're the melech, if you're the king, you're sort of above the difficulties. You can rise above. So rising above can happen in 3 stages. Rising above can happen in the era of miracles. Rising above can happen in the era of nature. You're being blessed within nature, but you could still, so you're not bound by the limitations. And then even when you're in the times of the exile of the Baal Shem Tov, who was in the exile, in a very bitter exile, you can rise above those challenges and get spiritual inspiration from the Torah and from Judaism. So that's sort of the model of what we're going to say here. The 3 figures that are related to Shavuot represent 3 ways where the Torah spells out. And maybe we'll read some of this inside. Maybe we won't, because I really want to get to the last point, which is how these 3 eras plays out within every single person's life. And that's interesting to me. So let's see. Okay, we'll read a little bit. We'll see how far we go, and then I want to jump to later on, again, playing out these ideas within the person. Okay, we'll see what happens. Since Moses, David, and the Baal Shem Tov were all leaders and kings, therefore we find that besides being wealthy and affluent, they also ruled over and controlled nature. In fact, their interactions exhibited elements of the supernatural. While leading the Jews in Egypt and guiding them through the desert, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, constantly displayed miraculous conduct. For King David as well, Hashem performed miracles and wonders, as evident in the many prayers and songs of gratitude that King David composed in the book of Tehillim. Many times he was saved from death, from people pursuing him, from Saul and others. And he thanks for Hashem for that in the book of Psalms. The Baal Shem Tov was renowned for his conduct that was replete with miracles and wonders, as publicized by the stories about him and his disciples. Indeed, idiomatically, and any fantastic incident is referred to as the Baal Shem Tov, as a Baal Shem Tov exploit. It is from them and through them that the qualities of kingship will be manifest and revealed within every Jew. Okay. Okay, so let's see if we can play this out. During their trek through the desert, the Jews who had received the Torah as souls within bodies openly retained some degree of the revelation from the giving of the Torah. Even as time passed, they remained in the desert, away from worldly distractions, and lived in a state of miraculous conduct beyond the constraints of nature in all matters. to devote themselves entirely to Torah, as our sages say the Torah was given only to those who ate the manna. So the sages describe the fact that the Torah was given to the generation of the desert because, in some sense, you need to be, to enable to internalize the scholarship, you need to be sort of in the ivory tower in a sense. You have to have a space where there are no distractions. And that's why later we're going to go into Israel. Later we're going to apply the knowledge of the Torah. But for the Torah to be given, the Torah was given to people who were separate and secluded from the distractions of the natural world. In the land of Israel, so that's the era of Moses. Now we move to the era of King David. In the land of Israel, Jews had already entered the inhabited land, living in a natural lifestyle. On the other hand, in Israel, divine providence was out in the open. As it says, a land in which Hashem, your Lord, seeks out. The eyes of Hashem, your God, are always upon it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. In other words, you sense the presence of God in the land of Israel. Even though the Jewish people needed to work the land, as it says, sowing and harvesting shall not cease, still the land also tended to be tended to by Hashem, as it says, absorbs water from the rains of the heaven. We openly saw that Hashem was the one who provided sustenance for all. Hence, it was evident that the mortal's effort in all that you do was simply to create a receptacle to receive the blessing that Hashem, your God, shall bless you from on high. In other words, here we're describing a situation where you're in Israel. You have to plow, you have to plant, because that's what the Torah tells you. You have to engage with nature. Nevertheless, you sense that the natural effort that you're creating is what the Kabbalists would call, you're making a vessel to the blessing that flows from above. So in other words, essentially the blessing is coming from Hashem. I'm just making a vessel for it through natural means. So that's stage number 2. Stage number 3, in times of exile, however, we don't see our signs. Quote from Psalms. We don't see our signs. In Hebrew, a sign is a miracle. In other words, we don't see the sign of the presence of God in our midst. In fact, the Jew might, God forbid, believe that he is subject to the same laws of nature as non-Jews. Consequently, it becomes imperative for us to strive to penetrate and illuminate the veil of concealment and the darkness of exile. And now we're going to say that's the 3 figures. Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm skipping a little bit. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, the conduit through whom the Torah was given, to the extent that the Torah is referred to by using his name. The prophets refer to the Torah as, remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. So he's named for it. He's got his name on the cover because he brought it to us. So Moshe enabled this generation who had received the Torah as souls within bodies, as discussed, to experience their identity as a kingdom of priests in a simple material sense. All their needs were received from above, without them having to work. Every Jew became wealthy and affluent, and their everyday lives was miraculous, as discussed. In other words, Moshe is the model, how the Torah affects us, and the Torah blesses us to the extent that we're not subject to the laws of nature. We're above nature. When they entered the land of Israel, however, an inhabited land, the manna, which was bread from heaven, no longer fell. As the verse states, when you enter the land, 6 years shall you sow. The Jewish people were then compelled to work, albeit in the land of Israel, where divine providence was openly revealed, and the truth was clear that livelihood came from above, but nevertheless they had to work. However, when a person is busy creating a vessel in a natural way to receive the blessing of Hashem, it may at times lead to a misconception. The person may delude himself into believing that his own effort his own efforts impact the flow of his livelihood. So, of course, earning his livelihood could distract him from learning Torah and performing mitzvot. This is the impact made by King David. He empowered every Jew to show that he is from a kingdom of priests, even in an inhabited land. This means that the Jew recognizes his livelihood comes entirely from above. Therefore, in truth, his livelihood is also plentiful and is at its root and essence miraculous. What he earns is not tethered to nature. He is involved with nature only because Hashem wants his livelihood to be channeled through it, and as the verse says, in all that you do. Thus, it is clear that when one is involved in Torah and mitzvot, he can do so without getting disturbed, like a king, as discussed in section 3. In other words, the second model is, so you have King Moses that gives us the Torah, and when we study Torah in the days of Moses, it's miraculous. King David is the model that you can remain connected to Hashem even when you're in an inhabitant land where you have to perform and act through the confines and the structures of nature, and nevertheless you recognize that the blessing is coming from Hashem. Then you get to exile, the third model. As the darkness of the exile set in, especially as it intensified and became darker, desperate times threw the Jewish people not only into regular workforce, in other words, the concept of you have to work for earning a living, which may be a distraction to holiness, but into hardships of earning a livelihood. Thus, the Jews required a new and loftier spiritual energy to awaken and uncover their royal character. A Jew may be inclined to think that in such times, meaning in the darkness of exile, when great challenges and obstacles to fulfilling Torah and mitzvot abound, it is more than sufficient to fulfill Torah and mitzvot as normal. This itself also requires a fierce battle and tremendous exertion to overcome challenges, etc. All the more so, it is true when a Jew strains himself further to beautify a mitzvah or to add to his Torah study beyond what is required. How is it possible during such a time for a person to devote himself to Torah and mitzvah as a member of a kingdom of priests, as if all the challenges and disruptions were non-existent? The Baal Shem Tov teaches that even amidst the darkest times of exile, a Jew can't completely transcend his surroundings. He can feel how he is a member of a kingdom of priests who Hashem himself, with the acme of divine providence over all details, miraculously orchestrates every detail of his day-to-day life, which is a very important teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the idea of highlighting the idea of divine providence, that Hashem, God, is with us in everything we do. This influence, eliciting the quality of being a kingdom of priests in the Jewish people during exile, is a greater novelty and quality in the concept of kingship than was evident in the previous two time periods, because again, there it was more obvious, and here it's concealed. To be able to see it is more powerful. Okay, so let's just summarize what we said till now, and then we're going to go to see how it applies within the life of every person, these three stages of connection to God as symbolized by Moses, by David, and the Baal Shem Tov play out in the life of every person. So just to summarize very quickly, the idea of the Torah is to show you and empower you that you're connected to God, and therefore you do what you believe in and you fulfill God's will despite the circumstances. Now, that concept plays out in different ways depending on the circumstances. In the times of Moshe, the people are above nature, there are miracles occurring. Okay, so then they sense the connection to God and they sense that they have to serve God. Beautiful. To show that I am a priest, that I'm connected to God, even in the times of David, is actually a greater accomplishment, because in the times of David, I have to engage in the physical world. So I'm engaged with the structure of the physical law, and nevertheless, I understand that it doesn't control me, because it's essentially what's giving me the blessing is God's blessing coming through and filtering through the laws of nature. And then the bigger idea, in some sense, the greater novelty, and the more radical idea is that even when you look around and there's a time of exile and there's suffering and there's persecution, the sense that God is with you, and therefore, but you can take control of certainly your spiritual destiny, and you can be committed to the Torah and the commandments because you sense that Hashem is with you, and because Hashem is with you, you're not bound by your surroundings. And of course, that's what the Hasidic movement did for hundreds of thousands of people, which is why it spread so fast. One of the reasons why it spread so fast, because the people had so many external difficulties, and this gave them, the Hasidic movement and the Hasidic teachings gave the people internal meaning and therefore internal strength to feel that their life has value and their life has meaning by connecting to God. And there was a tremendous sense of encouragement and empowerment that was accomplished through the Baal Shem Tov, the teachings of the Hasidic movement. But in some sense, it's actually more powerful than having that same feelings in the times of Moses or the times of David, because times of Moses and David, you have either miracles or blessings flowing through nature. So it's easier to sense God in that space. But the sense that God is with me and I'm not bound by my surroundings in a time of exile, that's in some sense more profound realization, and that comes about through the Baal Shem Tov. Again, it's advancing the same idea. Torah teaches that we are connected to God, we're infinite, and nothing can stop us. But again, how these ideas developed in three different eras comes out through these three personalities. And now we're going to say that in every single person's life, we also have these three categories. In other words, there's the space where you're removed from the world. There's the space where your sense that the blessings come through nature. In other words, you need the natural blessing, but you sense that it comes from God. And then there's the space where you're, so to speak, in exile, meaning you don't see the holiness. And the Torah teaches us how to navigate all those three parts of life. And just to speak, I'll give the general summary, then we'll read it inside. There's Torah study, there's prayer, and there's what we call, I guess you call it the neutral part of life, serving God in everything you do. So Torah, as we will see, Torah is beyond nature. Torah, when you start getting into the ideas of Torah, the philosophy of Torah, you go beyond. You're not in this world in a way, because your concern is the ideas. Your concern is connected to the divine wisdom. Doesn't really matter what's happening outside your window, right? The Talmud says that if you study the laws of sacrifices in the Torah, it's just like you brought the sacrifices. Well, how could it be like I brought a sacrifice? I'm not in Israel. I'm not in the temple. I'm not ritually pure. It's not the right time for the sacrifice. Doesn't matter. Torah brings you into the spiritual space where time and space melt away. It doesn't really matter what's going on outside your window. Right now, you are in the spiritual zone of Torah study. You're above the world. You're in the world of ideas. You're not in the physical world. Okay? That's one model of connection to God. Then you have the model of connection to God, which with prayer. And prayer is very interesting because we're referring to the prayer of the Amidah, which is the climax of the daily prayer, where you're asking God for your needs. You're asking God for livelihood. You're asking God for health. This is very interesting. This is sort of the middle ground of King David, because on one hand, you're not removed from the world. It's not like when you're studying Torah, I'm going into the world of ideas. It doesn't really matter what's happening in the real world. No, I'm praying for my needs in the real world. So I matter, my needs matter, my bank account matters, my stock portfolio matters. And yet I turn to God and say, God, help me. God bless me. God bless the produce of the year. Now, why are you turning to God? Doesn't it come from the field? Doesn't it come from the stock markets? Yeah, you understand that the blessing from Hashem comes from Hashem and flows through nature. Okay, that's the perfect model. That's the model of King David, sort of the in-between. You're being successful in the natural order, but you sense that it comes from Hashem. And then you go to the time which is like Galut, which is exile. You're not studying Torah, which makes you completely above the world. You're oblivious to the concerns of the world. You're not praying, which when in the state of praying, yes, you feel yourself and your needs, but you sense that the source of the blessing is God. You are you're living your life. In the language of King Solomon, know God in all your ways. So you're involved in your own ways. You're a neutral life. Baal Shem Tov teaches that you could serve Hashem no matter what you do, no matter where you are. There's a purpose and you can sanctify it. Okay, that's the greater teaching. That's like when you're in exile, you're removed from the awareness of Hashem. You're not studying Torah and you're not praying, and yet you could sense God in every area of your life. So that's how these three ideas, above nature, nature, and exile, play out historically in the era of Moses, David, and the Baal Shem Tov. And then within every single person, you have Torah study, which is that you're living a miraculous life. You're removed from the world. Prayer, which is in between. You understand your needs. You sense your needs, but you sense that your needs are blessed by Hashem. And then when you're minding your own business, you're living your own life. You don't feel necessarily that you're having a relationship with God now. I'm eating, I'm drinking, I'm earning a living, I'm going on vacation, I'm taking a walk. And the Baal Shem Tov says, you know what? It's exile. You don't sense the spirituality, but if you look deep, you can understand that this is part of your connection to God, and God is present with you, even and maybe especially when you engage in your daily life. So I think that this is a very beautiful model, and you can expand on it and think about it in different ways. But this is the core issue, and then we could sit here and say l'chaim and figure out how to apply it to our life. But let's read it inside. I'll read a little bit more. 10, 11. We'll read two more sections, and then we'll see what happens then. Okay, number 10. Let's share the screen. At the same time, in other words, after we explain that these three models apply to Moses, David, and the Baal Shem Tov, we're going to say it at the same time. God forbid to say that the impact of Moshe, David, and the Baal Shem Tov had, that the impact that of Moshe, David, and the Baal Shem Tov had was only in their respective generations. There is a little typo here, so I want to take a picture and fix it, get them to fix it later. Okay. Or only in the general era in which they lived. Moshe, the generation of the desert, David, when the Jewish people dwelled in the land of Israel, and the Baal Shem Tov during exile. This is because the impact of Moshe, David, and the Baal Shem Tov is eternal for all Jews in all generations. Therefore, Moshe is referred to by every Jew as Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, in reference to King David, every Jew says, David, King of Israel, lives forever. Literally, the quote from the prayer book is, David, King of Israel, lives and endures. Lives and endures. The idea is that Moshe is eternal. In other words, the teachings of Moshe apply to everyone. Same with David. And since it is Advent, since the advent of Mashiach depends on your wellspring spread forth to the outside, referring to the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, clearly this is relevant to every Jew in every generation. So the Hasidic teachings, which is going to trigger the era of redemption, that's the Hasidic tradition. So it's obviously relevant to everybody in all times. However, just as their impact was in general emphasized during 3 distinct periods, similarly in every generation, their impact is divided into 3 different categories of Jews, and for every individual Jew, 3 separate categories of avodah, of service. So avodas Hashem, the service of God in general, can be divided into 3 categories. There is Torah, avodah, which is prayer, and acts of kindness, practical mitzvot, which include the commands to know Him in all your ways, and that all your actions should be for the sake of heaven. These are similar to the styles of avodah characteristic of the 3 above-mentioned periods: the desert, the land of Israel, and times of exile. That is the Torah and prayer and knowing God in all your ways. In other words, your just neutral, natural life correspond to the 3 eras of desert, miraculous existence in the desert, land of Israel, and exile. So now we're going to break this down. Torah is the revelation of Hashem's wisdom. And the dynamic of Torah study works from above to below, revealing Hashem's will and wisdom in the world. Therefore, through Torah, a Jew is elevated higher than the world, like the Jews in the desert. Through Torah, one becomes a king. As our sages say, the rabbis are called kings, who rule over and control nature in accordance with the known adage of our sages on the verse upon the God who completes for me. Very interesting interpretation. Here, the Talmud says as follows: there are certain natural phenomena that the Talmud that is associated with time, with age. The child is 3 years old, or 12 years old, or 13 years old, whatever the case is. The question is that what the sages say, the age in Judaism is affected by the lunar calendar, by the Jewish calendar. So when you become 13 or 12, you become bar bat mitzvah, and different things happen at different ages. So the point here is the sages of the court, by determining when the new month begins, and remember, today it's set in the calendar, but in the Talmudic, in the times of the Mishnah, and in biblical times, it was fluid. It was up to the court, depending on the citation of the moon. So there could be a scenario where somebody may or may not be 12 or 13 or 3 or any other age, or they may be that age, depending on what the court would say. In other words, the impact of the court, the impact of the Torah is not just in the abstract, but it actually affects physical change in the physical world. So that's Torah. You're sort of above nature. Prayer involves petitioning for the needs of the worshiper. He actually feels that Hashem provides for his needs, like we said above, with respect to the land of Israel, but he is still busy with his needs. He makes requests for Hashem to provide what he is lacking. Nonetheless, even through prayer, a person still does not interact with physical objects in the real world, similar to the period when the Jewish people were living in their homeland, about which it says, each man under his vine under his date tree. They did not intermingle with the nations of the world. The person's connection with these objects is expressed solely through supplicating Hashem for his needs. In other words, yes, you're praying, so you're more cognizant of your needs, you're more cognizant of the physical world, but you're not out in the field. You're talking to Hashem. So you're still within the realm of holiness. The practical mitzvot that involve the use of physical objects, and certainly the spiritual act of refining permitted matters. In other words, things that are not an obligation. You do a mitzvah, you're refining the physical world, you're out in the physical world. But even if you're not doing a mitzvah, you're engaging in the physical world, but you're doing it for a spiritual purpose. Now, this is an area where you're actually in the world, refining the world. Purify and transform the concealment and darkness inherent in the physical world. So the light of the holiness will shine within them. This mirrors the time of exile when the Jewish people live among the nations of the world, etc. This is the quality of kingship that Moshe, David, and the Baal Shem Tov transmit to every Jew for all generations. Moshe, whose identity was centered around Torah, effected, revealed the essence of the quality of kingship of priests within the Jewish people in the category of masters of Torah. Since learning Torah is their vocation, they are detached from the world. Concerning these Jews, it says, who are the kings, the rabbis. In other words, he's talking about within every person, but also within every era. There are people who spend most of the time studying Torah. So that's the model of Moshe. Then you have David, who personified prayer, and therefore he composed the book of Psalms, achieved with the quality of kingship that even this mode of avodah could be carried out in the royal fashion. Although a person makes requests for his needs, these requests will be fulfilled. In other words, yes, we're in nature. We ask Hashem to bless us, but that comes to fruition. So in some sense, the miracle shines through nature. Okay, we'll skip a little bit. The Baal Shem Tov revealed Hashem's unity in the world. He publicized that the true reality of every creation in the world is the word of Hashem, giving every creation its existence and animating it in every moment. That's what we spent the second half of the second section of Tanya discussing. This Baal Shem Tov's teaching that every creation is created because there's a spark of God that's constantly within it. So in other words, you're discovering that Hashem is with you even where it's not obvious. However, he revealed this truth using Torah by publicizing commentary on a certain verse. Through the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, every Jew was empowered to navigate the realm of materialism and physicality, even during times of spiritual darkness, when signs are not apparent. In this ongoing battle to effect refinement, they can exemplify the qualities of a priestly member within the kingdom of priests. When a person goes out to war, he knows that he belongs to a kingdom of priests. He is on, meaning above your enemies. Victory, therefore, comes from above. As it says, Hashem, your Lord, will deliver them into your hands. Through this process, we take captive, we free the godly spark held captive within the material aspects of exile, thereby turning darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness. Okay, there's a lot to say. I just want to put this in the context of the general Hasidic teachings of the holiday of Shavuot. So the Hasidic teachings say as follows: the accomplishment of Shavuot, the giving of the Torah. What actually happened? If you put your finger on that day, the 6th of Sivan, what happened on that day? There was Torah before that. The patriarch studied the Torah, and not all of the Torah was given on the 6th of Sivan. The rest of the Torah developed over the rest of the 5 books of Moses developed over the next 40 years. Many of the commandments are only introduced later. So what exactly happened on that morning when we got to 10 commandments? So the Hasidic perspective is based on the Medrash, is that before the Torah was given, there was a divide between the spiritual and the physical. And you could engage with spiritual ideas, but those spiritual ideas are not going to impact holiness into the physical because there's a gap, there's a cut, there's a unbridgeable gap between physical and spiritual. When the Torah was given, essentially what happens is God descends on Mount Sinai, which means God breaks the gap. And God enables us, empowers us to bring the holiness into the physical. And that's what happened. And that's the big celebration. Now, in that process, there is a process and there is a spectrum of how we bring Hashem into the physical world. So there's the Torah study, there's the study of Torah, which in some ways is like Moses, above nature. There's prayer, where we're more involved in the world because we sense our needs, yet we sense that the blessing comes from Hashem. And then there is when we engage in action, either action of a mitzvah, a commandment, which we're actually literally taking something physical and making it holy, or something that's not a commandment, but it's just mundane, but we're using it for a spiritual purpose. You're eating breakfast so you can have energy to do good in the world. So then you're sanctifying that physical idea. And you're advancing the process of Hashem's descent into this world, which we celebrate on Shavuot, which we are all agents to continue doing that, each in our realm. But again, there's 3 stages. There's Torah, there's prayer, and there's action. There is the era of Moses, there's the era of David, and there's the era of the Baal Shem Tov. And the biggest novelty is if you can bring God to the most unexpected places, and that is discover God within exile and discover the connection to God in your mundane matters that are not praying to God not studying divine wisdom, not even a direct commandment of Hashem, but it's in the physical world that you live. You're doing so for a spiritual purpose to refine the world, to make the world a better place. So this is a relatively long essay. We skipped a lot. We weren't able to say everything, but I think that this is, as a model, this is very interesting because almost everything can fit into this model. You're either above the world, you're either in the world, but you sense that the world is being blessed by God, or you're in a space of darkness. And in all those areas, we have a figure, a model, Moses, David, and the Baal Shem Tov, who models for us how you can be connected to God and in that given situation. So I thought that was interesting. I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll see each other in good health and only good things.
I mean, thank you.